Hello and welcome to episode 138 of the Chills at Will podcast. It's a pleasure today to be joined by Professor or Miguel Valerio. A little bit about him. He earned his PhD from the Ohio State University. His research and teaching focus on the African diaspora in the literature and culture of the Iberian world from the late medieval period to the present. His research and teaching focus on, right, the African diaspora in the literature and culture, etc. His dissertation focused on Black cultural agency vis-a-vis religious confraternities and public festivals in the early modern Iberian Atlantic, particularly colonial Mexico City and Bahia, Brazil. His work has appeared in Afro-Hispanic Review, Confraternitas, and the edited volume Afro-Catholic Festivals in the Americas. He is currently completing his first book. This is a little bit older. We're going to talk about his first book, The Black Kings and Queens of Colonial Mexico City, Identity, Performance, and Power, 1539 to 1640. Just rolls off the tongue, that title, right? Miguel, it's a pleasure to have you. Doctor, it's a pleasure to have you. Professor, it's a pleasure to have you. How are you today?
I'm good, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Yeah, it's a title that just rolls off the tongue.
Same. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. So I'd love to start by talking about language. I mean, you're obviously you traffic in words, you traffic in language. Like, did you grow up monolingual? Did you grow up, Spanish first language, English first language, both at the same time? What was your relationship with languages, and then also with just the written word, like reading and writing around the house and school, etc.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I was monolingual till I was 10, so I was born in the Dominican Republic, and
Okay.
I had no need or
Uh-huh.
to speak any other language. And then when I was 10, I migrated to the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Okay.
So there I began learning English. And soon thereafter, I went into a bookstore and I found a book about Italian. And it's reading it and reading the lessons. It felt so close to Spanish
Hmm.
it became a goal of mine. So when I got to college, I studied
Okay.
Italian, and then when I did my PhD, I studied Portuguese. And just when you learn a second language, your brain develops, uh,
Hmm.
you know, these certain abilities. And so having the brain that is bilingual, then multilingual,
Hmm.
and enact a love for languages, right? Although I only speak four, me, I'm not.
Only. Yeah.
And I wish I would speak a little more.
Well,
Uh,
there's always what, Romanian, right? I mean, that's a
yeah,
Romance
there's
language.
Romanian, and I have a friend who's
Francese.
Romanian, but it's actually very difficult.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Romanian French is out of my league.
Okay.
I
Okay.
mean, I will need more time to dedicate it. And
Yeah.
it's also around the same time that I began reading. So in the Dominican Republic, as a kid till I was 10, I read the Book of Nature. If you think about medieval and Renaissance, I
Uh-huh.
think that's right. The Book of Nature is, the world, right?
Okay.
I grew up in a rural area. I played around. We did things. There wasn't much book reading. Then
Hmm.
when I migrated, I was my physical space was restricted, so books became the door to
Sure.
right.
Sure.
Real book became the book, and I read everything I could get my hands on. I used to love encyclopedia, collectania,
Hmm.
and then after that, one day someone lent me a book of poetry of Ruben Dario, and that
Okay.
was that was that ruined me for the rest of my life. I read poetry for a long time, and I still love poetry a lot, and that set me on my path of literature, right, to become a literary scholar. Although my book it's literary scholarship, but not you know modern literatures,
Okay. Right.
more through cultural practices and texts.
Sure. Ruben Dario. Dario? Say
Yeah,
so?
Rubén Darío, yes.
I definitely know basics. I mean, is he to the Dominican as like Martí is to Cuba? I mean, like national, like a national hero. Like,
No, so I have since after reading Darío, I have read the Dominican poets, So Dominican poets would be Salome Ureña. She's the most famous. She's actually the National Poetry Prize is named after her.
Oh, wow.
And then there are others that were Manuel del Cabral, Pedro Mir, that were important in the 20th century. But Rubén Darío is Nicaragua. He was Nicaraguan.
Excuse me, right?
There was actually a Nicaraguan nun who gave me his book.
Oh,
But
wow.
but Rubén Darío is like my aunt who grew up in the Dominican Republic and migrated later. But when she was in school, she memorized, and everybody did this in the old days. They had to memorize Darío poetry. So Darío is the pre-Neruda, right? He's one of those continental poets, and he was taught in school, and many people my aunt's age had to memorize poems. I know a few lines from, he has very famous poems. Yeah, so he's a big, and he was a founder of modernism, which was a renewal both in Latin America and in Spain. So it's the first time that a Latin American writer is influencing literature in Spain in a big way.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. So you talked about the Book of Nature. You talked about getting into more formal, reading and the poets, etc. As you got into college, into your, graduate studies, I mean, did you go straight to graduate studies? Did you kind of work in between? Like, what was your formal education as far as reading,
right. So from in terms of literature, what I read in school, primary education, from 6th grade onward, it was a lot of American and English literature. In high school, for some reason, the English teachers that I had, we did a lot of Shakespeare.
Okay.
So I know, well, I have read a lot of Shakespeare. And then when this nun lent me this book of Neruda poetry, it was discovering for the first time literature in Spanish. And then I went to New York to do my university studies. And then because I was living in the U.S. Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, there wasn't much access to books in Spanish, literature in Spanish, but in New York there was, right?
There you go.
And I got to New York right as they had some big Spanish bookstores that were just closing, like Torum and Macondo were just closing. But I started amassing books and buying everything I could and reading everything I could. I also had mentors, people who saw my enthusiasm in class, literature. So when I went to college, my major was philosophy, and then I took Italian and I took Spanish literature, and they saw my enthusiasm and mentored me, and kind of were the people that told me that this was a path, a professional path.
Well, tell me about the language. Like, in the book you write about like the Jesuits and Ignatius, and I went through Jesuit high school, Jesuit college. I know the Jesuits very well, but what was my point to that? Yes. This idea of, I remember one of the Jesuits, they're very worldly, they're very educated, they speak, one of my teachers, he was my Spanish teacher in high school, but he grew up in an Italian family. He spoke Spanish, he knew the Latin. I think I'm forgetting maybe one of the Romance languages. He knew some Hebrew and all of that. Do you have trouble, knowing so many languages? Like, do you get mixed up at times? Do you, oh, no es esta palabra, es esta palabra? Like, is that something that happens, or is that a good problem to have?
So I was, because I learned Spanish more or less through a more natural process, right? English was forced on me, so to say it, and then Italian was the language I wanted to study. So that, but also there was time, from 1 to 10 Spanish, then English, then so they came at unique periods were dedicated to them. The only one that Portuguese, which is the last one I study, sometime I'm speaking Portuguese and I get an Italian word in there, or vice versa. I'm speaking Italian and a Portuguese word get in there. So my brain is because I haven't spent much time living in either country where those languages spoken. I have been there.
Sure.
And I have friends that I speak, Portuguese too and Italian with, but my brain is still mixing those a little. They're still very close in my brain, I think.
En el lado de mi mamá soy italiano. Io sono italiano. Parlo un po', perdón. Parlo un po' de italiano. Quiero saber más. Tell me about the Dominican Spanish. Guagua es como autobús.
Yeah, guagua is autobús.
So I mean, like, I'm sorry, just the idea of like, you talked about like I think it was Dario, you were saying like in Neruda, like where the Spanish from the quote unquote New World came back to Spain and that kind of thing. Like, do you see in the scholarship, do you see the Spanish of the Caribbean still be considered like lesser than or different? Or is it like on par with, Español de, Castellano?
Well, the purists will always, will want standard Spanish, Real Academia Spanish.
Real Academia, yeah.
But the field of social linguistics, which has been around for 40, 50 years, they have studied language stigma, and of course now people are informed, right? And I mean, when I left the Dominican Republic at 10, I mostly spoke what you can call informal Dominican.
Okay.
So Dominican children, when they go to school, there is an effort to get them to speak standard Spanish. But still, outside of work, outside of a formal occasion, you can speak in Dominican Spanish. For me, because I left before I had a full formal education in Spanish, when I got to college, and then my interest in literature was nostalgia, because reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez and reading poetry did something to my heart and my memory.
Marquez, hey.
About a place I had left. But also I realized, that I didn't have formal Spanish. Even when I was doing my master, people were still correcting me. I still get words wrong. Well, wrong by certain standards, right?
Right. My first teaching job was teaching Spanish at a school that had a lot of native speakers, right? I'm a gringo, I'm a güero, I'm not a native speaker. And I remember a lot of the parents of my students were like, oh, cool, like our students, Hispanohablantes, like they're gonna get the real Spanish. And I was just like, no. Clearly I'm not,
right.
Spanish is the real Spanish, right? I wonder about the use. It seems like maybe Spain is on the, one side of the spectrum as far as like very much using tú. Maybe Mexico more with the usted. In the Dominican, is it heavy on usted or tú, or not? Doesn't really matter.
Yeah, so Spain is more informal, right? Tú y vosotros, and then the Dominican, in Latin America in general, there is more formality, even speaking with members of the family. Okay. And this is not universal. I mean, in my household, when I was growing up, we treated older relatives with usted.
Okay.
Like our great grandmother, our grandmother with usted, but our uncles and aunts we treated with tú. But then you can have another household next to ours where everyone treated themselves with tú. Usted is more archaic. I mean, in urban centers, tú is more used. So there is also a social signifiers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. You were talking about like, learning Shakespeare in school, and as someone who's taught English and Spanish, but an English teacher, like I'm not a fan of Shakespeare. Respect and whatever, but just not, not my cup of tea. But talking about like Dario and Dominican writers, etc. Did you feel like a sense of representation in what you read at all in those younger days? Whether that all the different cultures and subcultures that make us up. Did you feel like you read about people like you in all the different ways that that you are you?
Um, I um I don't know if I have ever read looking for myself in what I read,
Hmm.
as a person who uh, for some reason at some point developed this attraction to language, to words,
Sure.
and the way they work. Even Shakespeare, I was reading for the way words were put together,
Mm-hmm.
for the the musicality of words,
Right.
especially in Shakespeare. And I mean, in reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I did the world he describes, the Caribbean, did resemble mine, although I never saw gypsies in my hometown. But the geography, right?
Sure.
The plantations, right? Those I remember, or rainy days and stuff like that. Some stuff were, some stuff reminded me of I guess I was looking for the musicality and a universe rather than myself.
Mm. What?
Although I fancy myself a Hamlet sometime or whatever.
Hey. Did you read Shakespeare in the English or in Spanish?
Yeah, this was high school in English. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. I would be so
Yeah.
interested to read in Spanish, man. What resonated with you about Marquez? His short stories, and in particular his books, todos?
Well, the first thing I read by him, which it had just come out uh, when I got to New York, was his last novel, Memoria de mi puta triste,
Hey.
and it had just come out. It was the last novel, and then I read, then I read 100 Years of Solitude and other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As I said before, it was the geography, the place. For example, in Chronicle of a Death Foretold, my town was such a town. It was a small town. There were things that had to do with honor and in the
Mm-hmm.
sense of the novel, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is going on, and other things. It was a rural town, uh, which he describes. I mean, most of his work is in
Right.
rural places
Definitely.
that reminded me of my hometown.
Okay. Man, I love talking Marquez. Uh, I'd love to talk about getting into academia yourself. Did you always feel like that was a path once you started getting involved in languages? Were you on that path on your own? Did you have, a lot of mentors and people along the way who pointed you that way? How did you, if there was a eureka moment or maybe multiple where it was like, okay, this is what I want to do.
So when I was undergrad, I was in the seminary to be a priest. So that's why
Oh,
I studied
wow.
philosophy. But then, because I study Spanish and Italian, the people in Spanish, uh, they had told me when I was finishing up that they wanted me to do their master's program. Of course, I couldn't because I was in a path already.
Mm.
But when I left that path, uh, the first thing I thought is, what do I do now? Well, I'll someone offer me a master. I'm gonna go get this master. And so when I went back to New York to get my master's in Spanish, is when I found out that if I wanted to make a living, to have a
Mm.
salary, to have a stable job in doing what I love, teaching literature, talking about literature, reading and writing, um, that I needed to get a PhD, right? And then going to get a PhD was another learning experience. When I applied to the PhD, I still didn't know anything about academia, how it worked.
Mm.
I was lucky enough to get into Ohio State, that they saw my profile and liked it. And then both in my master's and my PhD, I had a great number of mentors that are still with me, who guided me along,
Mm.
and continue to
Yeah.
to guide me in the profession.
Excellent. Are you this time, are you like a full-time teacher? Are you on a sabbatical? Do you
Yeah, I'm a full-time professor. At the
uh-huh.
moment, I am on sabbatical writing my second book.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I usually ask that at the end, but tell us about your future project. Tell us about your second one, if you want to share.
Yeah. So the second book is so in the first book it's about brotherhoods, confraternities, and the festival that they staged in Mexico City, and looking at Mexico City as a center of an Atlantic world, of a broader world.
Mm-hmm.
And as you read in my bio, when I did my PhD, I studied Mexico and Brazil. So in a sense, I took my dissertation and divided it into two books. So the second book is going to be Brazil, but it's moving beyond festivals. There are two chapters on festivals. One of the festival is a Black King performance, but the other festival is something altogether different. But also in Brazil, these confraternities that I study were able to build their own churches, which they were not able to do elsewhere in the Atlantic. And also in some places, they gave these churches Afrocentric iconography. Into saints as Black, you have Black angels, stuff like that. So the idea of sovereignty continues in the second project, but in other practices, other sovereign practices.
Okay. Wow. Very interesting. Very interesting. So the Black Kings and Queens of Colonial Mexico City: Identity, Performance, and Power, 1539 to 1640. Talked about it being part of your dissertation. You preface it with the ideas of joy from Imani Perry. This was June of 2020. You write, Perry points out many see Blackness as a curse. As Perry contends, this is not to see Blackness as Black people see themselves, right? And then I think this was, I'm not sure if this is straight from her piece, quote, well, I think this is yours based on what she wrote. Joy is not found in the absence of pain and suffering. It exists through it.
Right. Those are her words.
Those are her words. Excuse me. Right.
That's the quote. Yeah.
Racism, poverty, incarceration, etc. Towards the end of that. But I do not want pity from a single soul. This is after listing all of the oppression, the anti-Blackness. Sin and shame are found in neither my body nor my identity. Blackness is an immense and defiant joy. I mean, just great writing on her part, obviously. This was a few months after George Floyd was murdered, and she wrote this famous piece in the Atlantic. Was this one of the seeds for the book? Had the book already been mostly planned and mostly written? Was the preface kind of ironically, was it maybe towards the end of writing this?
Yes. Yeah. So the way books are written, the preface is usually the last part.
Okay.
It goes, the introduction is usually the last part.
Sure.
If you add a preface, is the last part. So yes, but it was towards the end of the book. I was wrapping up the book at that time when George Floyd was killed, and all the Black voices and ally voices rose up in clamor. But then, of course, as Imani Perry was seeing in the news, it was a one-sided representation of Blackness as victimhood, and she wanted to respond to that. And because I was wrapping up my book writing, and I read that piece, and it resonated with what I was doing, because in the book, in chapter 2, I focuses on instances where Black people in Mexico were persecuted and even executed for this festive practice that I study in the book. But the example that I use in the preface to frame the book and connect it to the Black struggle in the present and through history is that those events began because a Black woman had been killed, and the Blacks in Mexico were clamoring for justice, because even if you were a slave in the Spanish Empire, you had certain rights, and this woman shouldn't have not been killed, right? Of course, I mean, that was a theory. The practice was altogether different, and no justice came about. But the Black people demanded justice. They came out on the street, demanded justice, and then things get mixed up a little, because the woman was killed in October. Then in December, the blacks are supposed to elect a new king. And they do that. And then this is interpreted by authority as a rebellion plot. So they arrest everybody, exile some people, and then the black king gets exiled. So the black have to replace him and elect another king. The point I'm getting at is that in this episode, every time the king is eliminated in some way by Spanish authority, the black replace him with a new king, right? Saying they're reinstituting their institutions and continuing their tradition, so that the struggle does not disrupt, right, the festive practice, right? It informs the festive practice. And as Imani Perry, it is that defiant joy that fuels, right, that feeds them, that gives them strength to continue on in a world that, that treats them as disposable things.
Well, it's like, I mean, for a couple of times there, I'm like, are you talking about 2020, or are you talking about, 15, 1600s? Because
exactly, that was exactly as I was working on that chapter, I saw, the longue durée. I mean, things have changed very little, as I say in the preface, but the idea of the book and the idea of Imani Perry's piece is not to remember the black struggle as just a struggle, right? As an empty struggle, as a sad struggle, but a struggle fueled by joy and defiance, by this defiant joy, which is affirming our being, right, throughout the struggle.
Well, yeah, when you talk about, like, the woman should not have been killed, obviously it's like, well, it's like the no justice, no peace that you heard in the protests, right?
Right, exactly, right.
Yeah, man. Well, you talked about chapter 2, which is called Rebel Black Kings and then Queens, in parentheses, Race, Colonial Psychosis, and Afro-Mexican Kings and Queens. And that's about a lot of it. What you write in that chapter is about, okay, like you said, like, when there were these festivities, these performances, and there were, shows of power by black people, and that power might have just, wearing jewelry, there was always like a paranoia there, right? Like, oh,
yes.
well, they're getting together, and you're making the point, like, no, they're getting together for these different reasons, for solidarity, for community, some to show, no, yes, we are loyal, or whatever the term would be, right, to the crown,
right, yes,
right. So chapter 1 is more about, laying the origins, early colonial Mexico, the origins of festive black kings and queens, and the birth of the Black Atlantic. You write kind of like a thesis of sorts towards the beginning. Quote, the performances studied in this book express this radical blackness, and what could be more radical than performing as a sovereign people in a slaveocracy? That's some Dario right there. That's some poetry. Quote, to study joy is not to forget pain. Just that balance there. And so you basically study, some smaller texts, but five main texts, I guess you'd say, throughout the book. Yeah. A lot of it seems to be in response to what you call, quote, the exotic genre. Right, this idea, I think of it today as like, oh, he's from Africa. Well, how many countries are there? How many different cities? How many different urban, rural? Right. But you're talking about there's a lot of there's scant information on a lot of this performance. So you do a really good job. You fill in some of the gaps with art, right? You write about, quote, listening to images. There was not a lot of Afro-Mexican festive visual art, but you do fill it in. You fill it in with some of these writers. So I just want to ask you, like, what exactly you mean by festive? I mean, we're talking about just parades, desfiles. I also want to ask you about, like, I feel like I know a little bit, but I'm by no means an expert. But, like, when you think of, like, Afro-Mexican, you mostly think of, like, Oaxaca, maybe Guerrero, the Costa Chica, maybe I don't know, Chiapas, maybe Veracruz. So if you could talk a little bit about people of African descent in Mexico City, and then also just like what do you mean by festive? Like, are we talking just the parades, parties, like what?
Yes, so thank you for those two questions. I'll start with the festive, which although I wrote the book, is a difficult question to define a term, right? When you get philosophical about a term, but so there are public festivals in which Black participates, and those take the form of desfile, parades, or religious processions, right? Performance within a religious profession. Most of the public festivals I study took place in the Plaza Mayor, today Zócalo in Mexico City.
Oh, okay.
And the one I study in chapter 4 took place inside the Viceregal Palace, which is today the presidential palace, right? Which a lot of people go to see because Diego Rivera painted the interior.
Is that where he does the Grito de Dolores too?
I think it's there. Yeah, he painted the history of Mexico at the National Palace.
Yeah, okay.
So those are the public festivals. There are 3 in the book, 3 public festivals, and then there are 2 private performances. Well, 2 documents, or various documents that describe 2 episodes. One is multiple, and one is just a single. One of them is 1608. It's a private party, so it's the Black community. It's not a public.
Right.
This is why it's problematic for colonial authority. It's in the house of a free Black woman, Melchiora, who is named. And then there's a coronation, there is dancing, there is eating, there is feasting, right? And then, so the document comes from a judge, who is actually the most detail we have about the coronation and everything. The other, the 1611 to 1612 episode that starts with the woman's death, that has several coronations throughout, right? Those we don't have much details. We can just compare to 1609. Yes. There was a Christmas party, then replacing the kings, so ceremony to elect new kings. So festive in the terms of the acts that are going on are celebratory. Okay. But also I think festive as an outlook on the world, right? That the world is just not gloom, but also there is something to celebrate about the world, right?
Right.